What a treat
Hell
to
yeah.
have Alex Press. And she is a journalist at places like the New Republic and, of course, at Jacobin. She's a staff writer. Welcome, Alex.
Thanks for having me. Good to be
Of
here.
course. Yes, thanks for coming on.
Well, perhaps this is a good lead into sort of a big picture question that I have for you, because
Mhm.
as we all know, Jacobin is not a liberal magazine, it is a socialist one.
Mhm.
And we as socialists don't just want workers to get a better pay and better
Mhm.
benefits, better conditions, et cetera, et cetera. We want workers to take over the means of production and run it
Mhm.
themselves, because people have the people making the stuff, we believe, have the right to control how the stuff gets made and, control over their time and their creative powers. So how might a union campaign like this one fit into the broader fight against capitalism and for socialism?
That's a great question, Jamie. And that's a gigantic question as well, obviously. I mean, the reality is the thing with a union campaign is that, unions are not revolutionary organizations. But they're insufficient, of course, for, if you want to take away Amazon from the bosses and put the infrastructure in the hands of workers. You're not going to do it just with the union, but you're not going to do it without organized workers. And a union is just what we call it when workers are organizing. And so, as it exists currently, we're living, at the whims of people like Jeff Bezos, and people like the workers in the Bessemer facility have no say at all in what they're subjected to, which is why you hear all these horror stories about these jobs, especially at Amazon. And so, a union is a step along the way, right? Because if workers are disorganized like they currently are in the United States, and more so than ever after this pandemic, people are more alienated than ever. They're suffering more than they have in a very long time, at least a lot of people. You're never going to get anywhere with that kind of disorganization and alienation. And so workers coming together and actually exercising the small number of legal rights that they have in this country is the first step along the way of actually them getting empowered enough to do something more. So if you want to demand that, say, the workers seize the warehouses, well, you're never going to do that if the workers can't even speak up and speak back to their managers, right? Without fear of being retaliated against. So if you don't have things like just cause, if you don't have things like protection against discriminations, if you don't have things like a livable wage, no one is going to have time to do anything further, because as Chris said, everybody's too busy trying to get enough rest to go back to work the next day. And so these efforts, I think, are incredibly important. And like I said earlier, you can't do it in one warehouse. That's just never going to be sustainable, even if you can win a union or win a contract even in that warehouse. Amazon is incredibly powerful, and they build in redundancy, and turnover is incredibly high. And so, these efforts, as they spur other efforts elsewhere and they start building kind of networks of organization among workers, that's sort of the blueprint and the early markers of what actual worker power looks like. That's my opinion at the very least.
I'm glad you asked that, Jamie, because now I bet a lot of people who were potentially dismissive of the points of unions. Now, no one can leave, basically, is what I'm saying. We are, I'm holding my own captive meeting right now. Yeah. I mean, we are the three of us, because there's power in union. Anyway, just wanted you to give a quick summary of the PRO Act, if you don't mind.
So the PRO Act is a sweeping labor law reform that has been passed in the House of Representatives by a vote of, I think, like 225 to, it passed in the House. I think everybody except one Democrat voted for it, and I think every Republican voted against it except for 5 people. I think 5 Republicans favored it. So now it's in the Senate. What it does is, so there have been several efforts to reform labor law. Labor law as it exists in this country is incredibly stacked in favor of the employer at every level. I mean, it's just like shocking when you first start paying attention to this stuff. It's like, how does a worker ever win a union in this country? It's really a miracle every single time that someone wins. And that's because, everything in this regime is stacked against workers. So this is a very ambitious labor law, which does distinguish it from past ones such as EFCA, the Employee Free Choice Act, which was sort of labor's big push when Obama got elected, which was less ambitious. It sort of addressed one problem within the sort of broad set of things that that stop workers from getting unions and winning contracts. And Obama didn't do anything to try to get it passed, even though he'd promised labor he would. And this is exactly how it always works with Democrats. Labor relies on them. They get out the vote. They do incredible mobilization to elect Democrats to, positions, and then they turn their back on labor and don't push for their priorities. So labor, to its credit, this time around has said, we might as well go for everything. We might as well have this sweeping, incredibly ambitious thing if we're only going to get, a sort of Hail Mary shot. And so the PRO Act, addresses all sorts of things. But basically, the point here of the act is that it makes it easier for workers to organize unions. It makes it easier for them to get first contracts. And it makes it easier for them to strike and otherwise take action on the job. It increases penalties to employers for violating the law. It gives teeth to the National Labor Relations Board to fine employers more for violating workers' rights, so on and so forth. So that's what the PRO Act is. It's a bit of a chicken and egg problem with labor law reform in this country, in that, unions are so weak that politicians, often don't have real reason to have to listen to them. And yet it's hard to get unions and workers stronger without reforming the laws. I mean, we're seeing it play out at the Amazon campaign right now, just how much the laws are stacked against unions. And so that's what this law is. I'm sure there's, people might want to debate the odds it has of getting passed, but that's what it is.
So how does this law address the issues that come along with the gig economy? Because I've heard it spoken about a lot in reference to that, and in reference to just like workers who aren't officially recognized as workers, right? Like, we all know that it's bullshit that Uber thinks its drivers are, small business owners, lol. But these do create real challenges. So, like, how does this help workers in the gig economy? And why are some freelancers organizing against it?
Yeah. So I think Katie mentioned this article, but I wrote something a couple days ago in the New Republic about this specific question, freelancers and otherwise gig economy people and their relation to the PRO Act. So the PRO Act, importantly, does apply to gig workers and freelancers, people who are sort of generally not considered legally as workers right now, thanks to sort of the malfeasance of the bosses on this, and the weakness of existing laws. So the key thing it does is it extends National Labor Relations Act protections to those workers. So these are the protections you have to take action with your coworkers, right? It's the right to collective bargaining and the right to actually do these things without being retaliated against by your employer. If you have NLRA protections, then your employer violates your rights, you have recourse. It's still hard, but you do have legal recourse and protections from the state. And so the NLRA does this by, it doesn't affect your sort of employment status, right? So it doesn't say that all of a sudden now an Uber driver is an employee who has minimum wage access and overtime minimums and things like that. But it does say that if you, whether you're an Uber driver or a freelance writer, if you're organizing with other workers in your industry, you are protected by the state. You have access to these rights under the law, the NLRA, which gives labor rights, and you can't be retaliated against, and you can collectively bargain with employers. And so that's a key thing here, because people are already organizing despite not having these protections. There are freelance organizations, there are musicians that organize, and there are gig workers organizations that, they don't have sort of the understood legal status as unions, in sort of our existing framework of what a union officially is, quote unquote. But there already are these organizations, but they lack those protections. So it grants those. So there have been sort of pushes to support this by organizations like gig worker collectives in California, for example. Also organizations like the Freelance Solidarity Project, which organizes freelance writers. Because again, it just sort of extends more protection so that you have recourse if your rights are starting to be violated. It's a whole nother step that it will take for us to win reclassifications, so that people who are misclassified, like Uber drivers, for example, have access to sort of their legal rights as workers. The PRO Act does not do that, but it does extend protections for workers who are trying to win those rights. And so it grants sort of safety along that path towards being correctly classified.